Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week, we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the economics of cigarettes. So, stick around for that. But our first data point is 1 trillion. And that's not attached to any specific economic object per se, but we did discuss Apple's market valuation of $3 trillion last week. And that got us thinking that this unit of measure of trillion is increasingly common in our economic discourse and specifically in public policy. But yeah, we've gotten used to talking about programs costing hundreds of billions of dollars. I think most people now are sort of inured to that or used to that. But this threshold of $1 trillion is somehow still significant. So we wanted to dive into this idea of the $1 trillion threshold in the economy and what exactly it means. So admittedly, this is a bit more conceptual than our usual segments, but we thought we'd give it a try. So stick with us, bear with us as we dive into that. So yeah, Adam, is it just basically time that we get used to thinking in terms of trillions of dollars when it comes to our public policy programs? And what primarily drives the size of the programs that we need, so to speak? Are there underlying natural needs? Spending on climate change would seem to be an example there. Or are our public needs defined by the economic system itself, like the growing financial system and the economy just need support by virtue of having grown, etc.?
Yeah, it's great we're doing this because I have been on a bit of a crusade about this trillions issue now for a while, last couple of years. Because, on the face of it, you'd think this is such a sort of trivial way to think about the world, right? It's about scale, pure scale. And when we're just talking about the number, it's just about the bigness of the number. And, that surely must be in some level missing the point. And of course, it's true that you then also always have to ask, okay, what are you actually going to spend all this money on? And is financing really the issue? But behind this reluctance, I think, to think about these really big numbers is a kind of refusal of reality fundamentally. And it's a refusal of the scale of the world, simply. Like, we live on a planet with 8 billion people. Roughly speaking, global GDP is $100 trillion. Roughly speaking, US GDP is $20 trillion plus. So if we're actually serious about spending money on anything for everyone, if we're serious about actually doing anything on a global scale, if we want to spend as much as $120, $130 like a cell phone bill in the United States on everyone in the world, that's $1 trillion right there. 8 billion times 120, right? I mean, that's the kind of ballpark we're in nowadays. And then, unless you're willing to go there, you are, in a sense, failing to grasp the scale of the problem. When you fail to do that, the really serious and drastic consequences follow. So if you spend an entire climate conference debating whether or not the rich countries can mobilize $100 billion for investment in low-income and developing country sustainability, we're missing the point. I mean, it's a Dr. Evil moment where, teleported from the 1960s or whatever, he decides to hold someone to ransom and he puts his little finger to his mouth and he goes, $1 million. We all groan because you can get a 1-bedroom apartment in an expensive city for $1 million. It's like, if you're going to do something significant, do it for real. And that's kind of where we're at. So yes, if you've got $100 trillion global economy and you're going to try and decarbonize it, you have to brace for, over the period of decades, maybe $100 trillion in investment spending over the next 20 to 30 years. Decarbonizing by 2050 probably entails $100 trillion of spending. Broken down over 30 years, that's $3 trillion per annum. That's about 3% of global GDP. That's, a defense budget's worth of spending across the whole globe. If you're not doing that, if you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, you need to look in the mirror and say to yourself, we simply are not taking this problem seriously. This is my reaction also to the Inflation Reduction Act enthusiasm. $380 billion over 10 years is $38 billion a year in an economy of $20 trillion. Folks, you're not actually serious. That's 0.1%. What? Give it, be generous. 0.2% of American GDP, 0.2. So 0.2%. I mean, that's now, of course, you then multiply it up. You imagine you're going to get various types of things going on. But really, are you doing enough, right? That's the central question. And that's where the $1 trillion moment is really the significant one. We have to somehow wrap our heads around this scale, because this is the simplest, really, in some senses, the simplest expression of the sheer awesome scale, complexity, and pace, dynamism, right, of the world that we're in. $100 trillion throws through the global economy every single year. It's another $100 trillion next year. In fact, it'll be bigger because the global economy grows, right? It was another moment like this for me was when Macron and Merkel were haggling over Eurozone finances, as they were wont to do, and Merkel put her little Dr. Evil finger to her mouth and says, well, I think it should be a low double-digit billion sums. And it's just like, Angela Merkel is a very smart woman. Angela Merkel knows perfectly well that the size of the Eurozone economy is measured in tens of trillions. So when she comes along and says, well, I think the overall, common funding framework should be low double-digit billions, she's basically saying, with a kind of a wink, we're not serious about this.
I do want to clarify, I suppose, when you make this appeal, who is your imagined audience? I mean, there is a kind of group of policymakers and elites who have responsibility for thinking on a global scale.
Yeah.
But then I guess I wonder, is there a democratic problem there? Because most normal people in their normal lives are precisely not encountering this scale. In other words, there's a kind of educational function also, I suppose, that elites have to sort of encourage the public to think on this scale or to introduce this idea.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about the elite thing, but that's why I'm glad that we're doing it on the show. Because I think it's three-tiered. Yes. I mean, politicians have to be willing to take these kind of numbers, as the Germans would say, take them in your mouth, right? They need to be willing to express them. Communicators, people in the public sphere, they need to stop panicking when these kind of numbers are raised. Journalists, in other words, folks like us doing this kind of podcast, we need to socialize this. And voters need to demand it. Voters need to say, I don't think you're serious if you don't come along. Think about when we had the Build Back Better discussion in the Democratic primaries ahead of the 2020 election. That was a moment, I think, where the Sanders campaign, by starting at the realistic level, which is that for the United States, over a 30-year time horizon, or even over a 10-year time horizon, forget 30 years, over a 10-year time horizon, the US should be talking about an investment program in the order of $8 to $10 trillion. That's nothing more than realistic. That's because the world is radical and huge and this problem is urgent, and that's what it means. And that's essentially just the defense budget of the US, right? That's just the Pentagon's budget. That's all you're promising to talk about. And by saying that campaign changed the discourse for everyone, so that even very mainstream Democrats, including Pelosi and Schumer and Biden, got on board with this and started pushing really big numbers as well for the stimulus package and then the original draft of Build Back Better that, of course, got kneecapped by Manchin and so on. But that is what I'm talking about. We need to unfetter this conversation. We need to shift the Overton window.
So just on a basic level, can we actually afford trillions in spending or debt?
Well, the affordability, I think, has three elements. The first is, what is your income? And if your actual income is measured in tens of trillions, as the United States GDP is, then trillions of dollars mean fractions of that income, which are not insurmountable, right? If you borrowed 5% of your income for some major investment, you wouldn't panic. So yes, if your income is in trillions of dollars, then your collective borrowing capacity and your spending capacity is in trillions of dollars too. All the more so if you are not an individual, but a collectivity. And that's another element of the we, right? When we speak about this we mean society as a whole, because part of what limits the capacity of individuals and families to take on debt to finance investment is, of course, that they have finite lifetimes. By the time you're in your 50s, you can no longer reasonably take out a 30-year mortgage, whereas in your 20s and 30s, you can, right? So that's what makes it affordable to finance a home, for some people at least, at that stage. But societies have infinite time horizons, or at least they will if we make the necessary investments and save ourselves from doom. And so that again reduces the time element here and basically means you can roll this debt and you roll it into a future which will be more prosperous. So your income goes up over time. And so what we borrow now will be a smaller burden. And then the third element is the basic macroeconomics of what we mean by afford. I mean, if we mean by afford, can we find the greenbacks? Can we write ourselves the checks? Then the answer is absolutely we can. It's a non-trivial matter of figuring out who in the end pays the bill. That's a redistributive political job within society. As Abba Lerner said, we owe this money to ourselves. And that in a sense means it is within the family, but that family then does actually need to agree who is going to pay. But that's a manageable problem, and there's no finite limit to how you can rearrange that. If what we mean by can we afford it is can we do all of the great things we want to do simultaneously at once, build all of the solar farms or whatever at once, the answer is, of course, not, because the constraint there is not actually afford. It's not a question of finance. It's the question of real resources. And there it's then a question of priorities, of timing, of pace. I mean, if we have enough time, presumably there will always be enough resources over an infinite time horizon. Within a limited time horizon, then we have to prioritize. But that's a matter not of affording, but of allocating economic resources. But in all of those ways, yes, trillions of dollars in spending and borrowing, they're just our reality, right? They're not even, this is the other thing, it's not even as though, it's an open secret that is the level at which we already conduct business.
Interesting. And so as a matter, just to underscore this, theoretically, there's no reason that our problems could be so large that they would be beyond our capacity to address them. There's no, in one could think that, yeah.
That doesn't follow. I think there's every reason to think that many of our problems are absolutely stretching our capacity to tackle them. Imagine if the pandemic had been much worse and we would fail to develop a vaccine, where we would be.
Well, as a matter of financing,
the constraint is not financing. And constraint is not financing.
Yeah, precisely. Okay. Because I asked because one could imagine that when one is contemplating things on this scale, one could feel insignificant. One could sort of feel a sense of hopelessness when one considers the scale of our problems. But you're saying, don't fret. We can actually consider all of our problems and not have to worry that we won't be able to, at least financially, be able to address them.
Fret about the right things is what I'm saying. and don't allow your anxiety about the big money numbers to get in the way of urgently addressing the things we absolutely need to be fretting about. What would be catastrophic would be if we, for fretting over the money numbers, fail to address the real issues which determine how we, our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will live collectively. That's exactly the thing we need to get over. We need to get on with making a planet inhabitable for 8 billion people, however big the money number turns out to be, because that isn't the issue. The issue is resources and technology and skills and politics. That's where the real rub is.
So, obviously, in a mathematical sense, numbers are continuous. There's no break between them. We can count as high as we like into the infinite, and there's no break there. But that doesn't seem to be the case politically. It seems programs grow stepwise over time in kind of stretches of punctuated equilibrium. Why is there that difference, if you were to venture a guess there?
I think it's a combination of three things. The first is a kind of well-known psychological fact. We all encounter it in stores all the time, which is the so-called magic number or price point phenomenon. And in other words, we'd rather pay $9.99 than $10 for something, even if it's 1 cent difference. And we know this operates in politics on the large scale because, for instance, in the Obama administration after the 2008 financial crisis, word was simply within the administration that nothing which had $1 trillion in it was going to be viable politically, so don't come with anything with $1 trillion in it. And one of the things which happened during COVID and in the first phase of the Biden administration was precisely that folks around Chuck Schumer, for instance, decided, yeah, you know what, we're going to do a stimulus that's over $1 trillion. In fact, we're going to go for 1.8, like make it really big. So that was a politics of that price point. And that's a real thing. I think the other thing goes back to the more real problems. In other words, there are problems which are lumpy. I think about the Manhattan Project or something like that. That just simply is a big number. When you set about building an atomic bomb for the first time, you don't know how much it's going to cost. but you kind of figure it's going to be pricey. And then all of a sudden, everything resets because you suddenly realize to do this and to get this kind of bang for your buck, the bang you get, spectacular, so it's well worth spending the bucks, but you do really need to spend tens of billions to get yourself the Manhattan Project on a single weapon, on a single bomb, right? So that lumpiness is a thing. And if you put those two things together, then I think you've got something like a kind of political project, policy program Overton window. In other words, this is a discussable amount of money for that kind of a thing that you're doing. And that's where we got to with central bank bailouts and liquidity surges, quantitative easing. There was a progressive widening of the policy Overton window where Ben Bernanke would buy, a couple of $100 billion worth of assets over a period of months. And in 2020, they were buying close to $100 billion a day. I mean, certainly over a week, they would buy $500 billion worth of assets if they had to, right? And that's because they realized to get the job done, stabilizing the banking system, you go all in. That's, as it were, the Manhattan Project realization. And then the price point shifts because you start realizing, okay, we can actually live with these incredible numbers. And so it's a combination, I think, of those three effects: the psychology, the underlying lumpiness of the problems, and then the shifting of the policy Overton window around that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just to address the psychological questions here, I mean, yeah, and to some extent you're pointing to the kind of socialization as an impediment, simply not being used to hearing these numbers. But I wonder if there's a kind of natural foundation to some of these psychological fears. Just again, a sense of being overwhelmed by the scale here. That seems to me a kind of natural phenomenon. One says trillions of dollars, and one can't simply maybe process that. As I was reading up for our discussion here, I came across an article about the work of Walt Whitman, who was a 19th century US poet. And yeah, it's remarkable how much he talked about large numbers in his work. And he had a kind of serenity in how he dealt with these large numbers in his works, including Leaves of Grass. He would just kind of enumerate all the things in the world and the universe. And he would, cite things being in the units of millions, billions, trillions, even beyond that, septillions, octillions, decillions. And somehow all of it would put him at ease. So somehow he had an aesthetic approach to these numbers that didn't make him feel insignificant. It made him feel part of some larger, unit, some larger immortality that he was part of. Yeah, rather than diminishing him. Even just to read a bit here, he says, "I do not think 70 years is the time of a man or woman, nor that 70 millions of years is the time of a man or woman, nor that years will ever stop the existence of me or anyone else. Is it wonderful that I should be immortal? As everyone is immortal, I know it is wonderful." So maybe that's infantilizing itself, but he...
Oh, no, I wouldn't. I'm going to advocate, I'm going to take a Whitmanian approach to public debt in future.
Why not?
This is a fantastic idea.
Yeah, Democratic Vistas is a political program.
Precisely. No, that is literally... Because this is constraining of democracy, right? This kind of discourse of limits is quite self-consciously as well. It's fear of freedom. It's fear of what is empowered by that notion. What a great segue. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we do have to end up here anyway, so we'll take a break and be back to talk about cigarettes. Our next data point is 35%. That is the share of sales of tobacco company Philip Morris that are now derived from smoke-free products, including the e-cigarettes that have become increasingly popular in recent years as an alternative to classic cigarettes.
For Philip Morris International, it's not exactly cold turkey. The transformation here is away from those traditional cigarettes to new...
There are likely to be less traditional smokers in years to come, and now e-cigarettes are taking over a share of the market.
Philip Morris International says many countries could end sales of combustible cigarettes within 10 to 15 years. Joining me now...
That 35% is the basis of Philip Morris's claims to investors and shareholders that it should be considered an ESG company, a company that adheres to environmental, social, and governance standards. That's a pretty remarkable claim, so we thought we'd dig into not only that, but also the general economics of cigarettes. So, yeah, let's just start with the ESG claim. I mean, what exactly is Philip Morris's case here for being an ESG company?
Yeah, it's really vertiginous. I think to get your head into the mindset of the people making this claim, you have to start from the proposition that there's 1.3 billion people out there who are addicted to this dangerous habit that's going to kill at least half of them. And so then the question is, what do we do about it? And you don't ask questions about how you ended up in that situation or who's responsible for it. But then the question is, how do we address this crisis? And realistically speaking, 1.3 billion people are not going to go cold turkey and quit. So the way forward is to reduce the harm being done. And so the way forward is to sell them various types of vaping. So whether it's a vape, which is a fluid with nicotine in it that you heat, or whether it's Philip Morris's product, which is called IQOS, I gather, which is more like a stick form of nicotine, they believe is healthier than cigarettes. In fact, that's hotly contested in the medical literature, because when you heat tobacco, you just generate these toxins, and that's kind of the source of the main problem. In any case, Philip Morris's vertiginous claim is that because they are going to offer and increasingly displace cigarettes by these vape sticks, that makes them a company which is going to pioneer a smoke-free world. It's unbelievable. They actually have this phrase, unsmoke the world, and they borrowed this from the perhaps no less vertiginous strategy of BP, the oil major, which in the late 1990s, early 2000s rebranded itself as Beyond Petroleum. And so that seems to be the basis of this improbable claim.
So if we were to look at smoking from an average smoker's perspective, how much exactly does an average smoker spend on their smoking habit?
It's a gigantic amount, and it depends crucially not on the cost of producing the cigarettes, which are trivial. It costs 25, 30 cents to produce a pack of cigarettes, unbelievably. They're one of the original mass-produced, mass-consumed products in the world, actually. But nowadays, the vast majority of the price of cigarettes everywhere in the world is made up of tax. And so that varies by locality. Within the United States, it can vary by a factor of 2, almost 3, from low-cost, low-tax states like Virginia to New York State. But if you add up a pack a day over the likely life expectancy of an American smoker, even in a low-cost state, you come to $100,000 plus. If you're in a high-cost state, you're talking almost $250,000. If you add in what the additional health premiums that somebody like that is spending, because to get health insurance if a smoker is much more expensive, you add another $20,000 to $30,000, and then the real money adds up. If you imagine that rather than spending the money on cancer sticks, the smoker spent the money on a savings account, simply put the money in a savings account, invested in their pension, their kids' education, their future, an apartment, right? You're talking really huge amounts of money. So even at a modest interest rate of 4%, the lifetime smoking habit of a New Yorker would probably add up to $750,000 in terms of foregone accumulated savings. Massive amounts, just in purely economic terms, not accounting for the lethality of the smoking habit.
Yeah, that truly is a life-changing amount in an individual's life. But if we were now to look at the sort of spending on a social level, I mean, how much societal health spending is tobacco use responsible for?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to do these kind of numbers. I mean, sorry, I say that in a rather kind of academic way. I mean, it's horrifying, but also, how do you do the math on this? I mean, one way of estimating it is to go to the healthcare costs, so the additional costs due to smoking-related disease. Another one is to do with lost productivity due to illness. And a third is the lost productivity from premature mortality. So if you add up all of those together, you end up with truly staggering numbers. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, has done estimates which put the cost to world society easily in the $1 trillion, perhaps even close to $2 trillion mark. The healthcare expenditure alone is thought to run to at least $500 billion. So the most widely circulated estimates date back 10 years to 2012. So we should probably update those. But at the time, they estimated it was 5.7% of global health expenditure. So $1 in $20, which is quite staggering if you consider the full range of things that have to be covered. If you add in the lost productivity and excess mortality, this is where you start pushing towards the $2 trillion mark, which puts you in the ballpark of 2% of global GDP. So, really huge amounts of money. For the United States alone, and because the US is a rich country, and so therefore lost productivity and lost lives are valued more highly according to the rather sort of cynical, cold-blooded logic of this kind of calculus, you end up with a figure for 2018 of at least $600 billion a year in lost income. Half of that is, $240 billion of that rather is healthcare spending. $185 billion is smoking-related illness, and $180 billion is premature death. So against a US GDP of $20 trillion, we're talking about 3% of US GDP. That's a very significant slice of discretionary expenditure in the federal government budget. That's the kind of money that would get us to the energy transition. If America's government was spending 3% of GDP per year on the energy transition, we'd really be going gangbusters on renewable energy. So we're talking absolutely massive costs. So by one estimate I saw, the societal cost of a single pack of cigarettes comes out at about $35. So taxing them at $10, $15 is actually not fully capturing the cost here. And certainly the revenue from cigarette taxation doesn't come close to covering the overall impact. It's a profoundly antisocial industry built up over the last century and a half and massively reinforced, even in its current form, following the major lawsuits, as a real drain on literally a cancer on the body of society.
So, what exactly is the most effective public measure for reducing tobacco use? Is it simply taxes on tobacco? You just mentioned that as a kind of anti-tobacco measure, or are there other forms of public spending that have proven effective here?
The literature seems to be very unambiguous and, in fact, quite determined to make the point that taxation is the way to go here. So a 10% increase in price appears to reduce cigarette consumption by between 3 and 5%. And it's particularly effective with young smokers. So they're 2 to 3 times more likely to respond to increases in prices than adults, and lower income populations who are multiply disadvantaged, obviously, in so many ways, are also more likely to smoke fewer cigarettes if the price goes up. So we're really talking about millions of lives that can be saved by simply upping the price of this, antisocial product. Millions of lives. So the WHO estimates that effective global tobacco control measures save between 5 and 7 million lives a year. Simultaneously, of course, there is also, as a result of this taxation, a very active, illicit, underground global network of cigarette smuggling, either of legitimate, original manufactured cigarettes or of, much worse, counterfeits, which are produced at much lower quality standards and are even more dangerous than the original branded cigarettes that they replace. And even in advanced economy markets like the UK, they're estimated to account for 20% of cigarette consumption, particularly attractive to young people who like to buy cigarettes through illicit channels. And in developing market economies, it's even larger. In places like Malaysia, the smuggled share goes up over 70%. So there we're talking about a largely unregulated trade in a very dangerous product.
Yeah, that leads me to the last question I wanted to ask here, which is about cigarette use elsewhere in the world. I mean, if traditional cigarette smoking is on the decline in the West, again, that's Philip Morris itself is stating that as a goal of its business. But how does it look in an international context? Do people in developing countries still spend on cigarettes, and when they get a certain amount of discretionary income, is smoking still one of the things that they tend to spend on?
Yeah, this is absolutely part of the cynicism of the Philip Morris effort to brand itself as an ESG asset, because whilst they are pushing the non-smoke generating versions of cigarettes, which they suppose are healthier, to advanced economy markets, they are pushing regular conventional cigarettes very hard in markets like Egypt, Thailand, and Turkey, which are amongst Philip Morris's most rapidly growing markets worldwide. And that, it's an open secret and visible in their annual reports that they are pursuing this sort of twin track strategy around the world. Of the 1.3 billion men and women that use tobacco regularly, 80% are in low and middle income countries. And there are huge variations, however, very interestingly. So Africa as a whole, sub-Saharan Africa notably, has the lowest rates of cigarette use in the world and very low rates amongst women. By contrast, in Asia, for men, East Asia notably, in China, for instance, 50% of men smoke. And the rate is lower in the Middle East, but there's a huge gap there between men and women. And across much of the emerging market and low-income world, there's still disinhibited advertising of the classic type that you and I were exposed to, Cam, as kids. The Marlboro Man advert selling cigarettes as cool that prefaced every single movie I went to in Germany as a kid. Vividly remember the scenes of it. It's the first place I first saw the Grand Canyon was in a Marlboro advert, and it was a very beautiful film. But in Indonesia, they recently ran a campaign, be strong, be daring, be brave, be Marlboro. So that kind of advertising is still going on. And the awesome implication of this is that if you think of cigarette smoking as a global pandemic, and you think of the first wave of consumers to be sucked into this in the late 19th and early 20th century being our grandparents and great-grandparents, who were heavy smokers and began to die in large numbers in the 50s and 60s of cancer, which is what then produced the medical research and the evidence and the campaign against smoking as a cancer cause. The majority of the deaths which are coming our way in the 21st century, and we expect 1 billion people ultimately to die of cigarette smoking, the majority of those are going to be in the low-income and emerging market world, and that will play out inexorably, more or less regardless of what we do now with regard to reduction. Those deaths are feeding through the bodies of hundreds of millions of people around the world in the form of cancer, and will overwhelm or at least impose huge pressure on the healthcare systems of middle-income and low-income countries in decades to come.
Just for my own edification, are the cigarette companies primarily from the West, or do they have sort of local cigarette companies as well that are major players here? Do you happen to know that?
It's a quite concentrated industry, so the big global players tend to be the original Western players.
Yeah, I could imagine. I ask this because I could imagine some kind of anti-Western kind of uprising, against this drug being sort of pushed on the developing world from the West. You could, I don't know if at some point there'll be some kind of self-consciousness about the kind of trap almost that the West seems to be imposing on the rest of the world with these cigarettes. But again, I guess it's plenty of people enjoy smoking them despite all the bad effects. Okay, we'll leave it there for now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It is produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcasts is Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested not just in Adam Tooze, but news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Ones and Tooze listeners even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That is TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love hearing your feedback. You can send us voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or you can email us, podcasts@foreignpolicy.com, or tweet us. That's at Ones and Tooze Pod. Thanks very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.